Dragon aspects in Hearthstone have been pretty game-changing cards over the years, and with a new dragon-focused expansion announced for World of Warcraft, we thought we'd highlight some of the best in Hearthstone. And at number 10, we have Kalecgos. This 9-mana 4/12 dragon initially costs 10 mana and has the effect where you get to discover a random mage spell, a keyword which lets you choose one of 3 randomly generated options, and it makes the first spell you play each turn cost 0 mana. I should note that if you play a spell before you played Kalecgos, you won't get the discount since he only makes the first spell you play each turn cost 0 mana. But besides not being able to coin out Kalecgos and get his full effect, his effect is great no matter which game state you're in. If you're ahead, you can find a spell to push for advantage. Or if you're desperate, you can try to fish for a big removal spell. Or if you're really desperate, you can try to Hail Mary with one of Mage's many entirely luck-based spells. While Kalecgos is intended for you to be able to discover a spell, pick whichever one you want, and cast it for free, he also has the option of making any of your other spells in your hand cost 0 mana, as long as it's the first spell you're going to cast that turn. You can cast whatever big spell you want. And if Kalecgos manages to survive, you can use his effect to make another spell cost 0 mana on your next turn. This card was one of the main payoff cards of the LPG Mage, a deck which used Luna's Pocket Galaxy to make all of her huge minions cost 1 mana. This deck was pretty gross, especially when Galaxy was buffed to only cost 5 mana, and was so good it tore up wild before it was reverted back to 7 mana. For now though, Kalecgos deserves his spot for being at least somewhat playable in wild, a feat few aspects not on this list have achieved, but is still a very fringe card. The rest of the cards in this list have been a lot more prominent, at least in standard, but that could soon change. Recently, Kalecgos has been added to the Core 2022 set, which is a yearly rotating collection of cards available to all players, meaning he is now also playable in Standard. Hopefully, with weaker competition, Kalecgos can find viability, but for now, he sits at the number 10 spot on this list. And at number 9, we have Deathwing Dragonlord. This version of Deathwing is also a neutral 10-mana 12/12 dragon, but it has the effect where he puts all dragons in your hand onto the battlefield when he dies. A fun fact about this card is that it is, to my knowledge, the first ever card printed that was an alternative version of a legendary that already existed, and lets you play 2 of the same character. Of course, nowadays, and in other card games, this is taken for granted, but it was pretty novel at the time. Anyways, this card never really saw any play except for a fringe, off-meta, big dragon deck. You see, the reason why this Deathwing can have such a big effect while still being well statted is because it takes forever for it to get its effect off. On top of having to wait until 10 mana to play him, you also have to find a way to kill him to get off the effect, which is no easy task with 12 health. And if your opponent was scared of having to deal with all the dragons Deathwing could summon, they could always find a way to silence, transform, or shuffle it to negate the on-death effect from triggering. And for nearly 2 years, he remained pretty much unplayable. That is, until a critical mass of good big dragons were printed, and a cheesy big dragon rogue rose to infamy. This deck used the newly printed Necrium Blade, which triggered a death rattle effect when it was broken. To trigger this Deathwing's death rattle, which could be copied with the 4-mana Necrium Apothecary, and if you were really lucky by turn 4, you could have a full board of enormous dragons, and kill your opponent shortly afterwards. This deck was so broken when it did finally hit its, at best, inconsistent combo, that Apothecary even got nerfed to 5 mana. And while this combo is still just as good as ever, I think players are put off by its purely RNG-based strategy, even if it is an instant win if you do manage to hit the high roll. And at number 8, we have the original Alexstrasza. This 9-mana 8/8 neutral dragon lets you target either your hero or your opponent's hero and set their health to be 15. For reference, all heroes and classes in Hearthstone start the game with 30 health. And unlike in other card games, in Hearthstone you can't heal above your hero's maximum health of 30, bar for one exception. Armor, however, is a very common mechanic, which adds health points on top of your hero's base health. This means you can effectively gain infinite health on your hero as long as you have the armor to do it, while your base health caps off at 30. What this means for Alexstrasza is that it doesn't set a hero's maximum health to be 15, rather she basically damages or heals a hero so their health is exactly 15. And since now you know how hero health and armor works, you'll understand why Alexstrasza's effect won't touch armor at all. In the early days of Hearthstone, one infamous deck used to run Alex and show off her terrifying power. Freeze Mage was a deck built around stalling long enough with ice-themed cards until the right time. Then on combo turn, with an ice block up, they would play Alexstrasza, end their turn, and on their next turn use some combination of Frostbolt, Ice Lance, and Fireball to deal 15 damage to their opponent. Of course, by modern standards, this combo is laughably easy to play around, but back then, the only real options you had were to kill them before their combo turn, or to heal or armor up out of range and hope they didn't have enough damage to kill you. Her flexibility was also devastating, since she wasn't a dead card even against aggro matchups. For example, if you faced off against an aggro deck like Face Hunter and needed a little bit of healing to survive, you could always play her when you were low at health to be reset back to 15. But since then, other, cheaper, and more efficient healing and damaging options have been printed, but the OG Alexstrasza still deserves a spot on this list for how influential she was during the beginning of Hearthstone's life. And at number 7, we have Murozond. This 8-mana 8/8 Priest Dragon is the leader of the Infinite Dragonflight and plays all the cards your opponent played on their turn, but for you. So at first glance, this card may seem really good, being an 8-mana 8/8 with an insane upside. And well, that's because it is. A theme with a lot of the cards on this list is they are very good, probably because Blizzard wanted their iconic dragons to also be everywhere in Hearthstone. Some notes about this card is that although Murozond does say play in its card text, it doesn't actually trigger the battle cry of a minion, and plays spells but with random targeting. So for example, if your opponent played Dr. Boom and Dark Bomb on their turn, Murozond would only summon the 7/7 body of Dr. Boom without the Boom bots, and cast Dark Bomb with any random target. And what's great about this card is that if your opponent were to play one of their win conditions, a high value card, or a crazy combo turn, Murozond would copy it all for just 8 mana. In addition to just being a generic good card in value, he also had uses as combo disruptor and as a combo piece. Back in the day, a pretty common priest combo involved using King Togwaggle and Murozond to kill your opponent with fatigue. Assuming you had an empty deck, King Togwaggle would swap decks with your opponent, putting them into fatigue, and giving them the King's Ransom card, which let them swap their decks back for 5 mana. But when they did that, you could just play Murozond to reswap your deck permanently, giving them your empty deck and putting them into fatigue. And as cool as this combo was, it died out when Reno Priest and the rise of the better and faster win conditions. Unfortunately, the Murozond only comes in at number 7 spot because as of yet, he has yet to be a truly degenerate card like the rest of the cards of this list. But just like Kalecgos, and with his inclusion as the Priest Legendary minion in the new 2022 core set, he may finally be able to find more success during his second bout in Standard. As of now, it's too early to tell, but he could easily move up a couple spots in the future. And at number 6, we have Ysera Unleashed. This 9-mana 4/12 Druid Dragon shuffles 7 Dream Portals into your deck when played, which summon a random dragon when spawned. This version of Ysera single-handedly made Dragon Druid, a previously meme tier deck, into one of the strongest standard decks ever at the time. This deck basically used all the new dragon support cards printed in Druid in order to play Breath of Dreams. This card is a 2-mana spell that lets you draw a card and gain an empty mana crystal if you're holding a dragon in your hand. This card is absolutely insane if you can get its conditional effect to go off, and is comparable to a pre-nerfed Wild Growth, one of the strongest cards of all time. And because Breath was so crucial, a Dragon Druid had to play a decent number of dragons, like Ysera Unleashed. Not only does this card let you summon up to 7 dragons of any cost, most of which costs 5 or more, each portal is free and can summon the legendary dragons from other classes. And despite being a 9-mana card with no immediate effect, the potential to summon huge free dragons each turn made it very worth it. On top of that, Emerald Explorer, one of the best new dragons printed, lets you discover a random dragon when played and offered Ysera as a quite often option. You see, class cards are more likely to be offered as a choice during Discover options, and since Emerald Explorer and Ysera Unleashed were the only Druid dragons, one or both of them would almost always be an option. That meant you could almost always pick Ysera Unleashed, shuffle more Dream Portals into your deck, or another Emerald Explorer, in hopes of offering yet another Ysera. Despite being a debilitating 9-mana, some Druid decks in Wild were able to squeeze in Ysera as one of their contentious late-game cards, just because of how much value momentum each Dream Portal offered. And at number 5, we have Nozdormu the Timeless. This version of Nozdormu is a 4-mana 8/8 Paladin Dragon and sets each players to 10 mana crystals when played. The idea behind this card is that even though an 8/8 body for 4 mana is an amazing deal, your opponent is the first player that can actually use all 10 of the newly generated mana crystals, since yours are all empty. One deck quickly rose up with the release of Nozdormu, which basically packed every good expensive card Paladin had around a Tip the Scales package. This package consisted of High Abyss Allura, Tip the Scales as your only spell, and a ton of Murlocs. And what you'd hope would happen was that you'd play Allura, which casts a spell from your deck whenever you played a spell, play the coin, and cast Tip the Scales, summoning about 20 mana worth of Murlocs. It may seem like giving your opponent the max amount of mana to play around with is an awful play, given how completely awful Temporis is. But if your deck is built to be able to spend 10 mana each turn, you can easily win. For example, if you play Nozdormu against an aggro deck, sure, they'll probably be able to dump their entire hand and gain a lot of initiative at first, but if you're able to survive their initial wave, then your opponent won't have any cards left in their hand, forcing them to watch you spend all your mana each turn until you're able to turn the tide and win. And this basic game plan works so well, even against really slow control decks, that Allura got nerfed to 5 mana, since Allura tipped the scales in Nozdormu gave Ramp or Scam Paladin too many instant win plays. And with the Murloc package, even if Ramp Paladin whiffed, they still had a fairly decent early game. And even though Ramp Paladin and Nozdormu were extremely oppressive, I can only place it at the number 5 spot on this list because it basically died overnight to an indirect nerf. And at number 4, we have Alexstrasza the Lifebinder. This neutral 9 mana 8/8, when played, either deals 8 damage if you target an enemy character, or restores 8 health if you target a friendly one. Although this version of Alexstrasza can't potentially deal or heal as much damage as the original Alexstrasza, she does offer more flexibility and consistency. Like in most card games, direct damage is valued so much more than healing, meaning Alexstrasza is almost always used to deal 8 damage. And it might surprise you, but other than Ragnaros, whose effect is random, no other minion in the game can deal 8 damage to an opponent's hero without any other requirements or strings attached. This is really important because control decks, the main type of deck that Alexstrasza is played in, were finally able to slot in some burst damage potential, while still being flexible in other use cases. Or in controller mid-range matchups, Alexstrasza could be used to deal 8 damage to a minion, already making you go neutral in card advantage while putting a huge start on the board. Or when you're really desperate for healing to get out of range of a combo, you can heal your minions or yourself, though this is the least efficient option. In comparison to other cards, Alexstrasza's Battlecry is worth anywhere from 3 to 8 mana, while giving you a massive 8/8 body. In practice, Alexstrasza was used in pretty much every mid-range and control deck until the core 2021 set rotated out, where she still saw play in the occasional Reno deck, even to this day in Wild. And at number 3, we have Malygos the Spellweaver. This new, reprinted Malygos is a neutral 9 mana 4/12 that draws spells from your deck until your hand is full. This card is amazing, and if it weren't for how insanely powerful the standard format was at the time, this card could have definitely had decks built around it in the past. The ability to potentially draw 10 spells from your deck is worth about 10 mana, on top of the very respectable 4/12 stat line. And when this card was first printed, the only real limitation of it was that there weren't that many decks that had a lot of good spells, and how fast the meta was. This Malygos offered a ton of value, or card advantage, in exchange for being very expensive and slow. Most other good expensive cards, like the raid boss Onyxia, had to also offer some tempo or immediate board impact, otherwise you could potentially spend your entire turn playing a minion that your opponent could just ignore. To get around this, Malygos was playing a deck which could either cheat him out for much less mana, or desperate for card draw, or wanted him for Kazakusan. Like most expensive cards in Hearthstone, if you can find a way to discount its mana, you should find a way to do so. In Standard and even in Wild for a while, Celestial Alignment was the premier way to satisfy your inner Timmy. Celestial Alignment is a 7 mana druid spell that sets all cards and mana crystals to 1, meaning post-alignment your Malygos will be a 1 mana 4/12 that can potentially refill your hand. This comboed great with Lady Anacondra, which down made most of your spells cost 0 mana, letting you play any druid nature spell you wanted for free. Some other notable threats, like Questline Hunter, whose deck was almost entirely of spells, and Mechathune Warlock, which wanted to draw through their entire deck, also loved Malygos' insane draw potential. And although he had a slow start, Malygos even sees play today in Standard as one of the 2 stable dragons that is played with Kazakusan. And speaking of blue dragon aspects, and at number 2, we have the original Malygos. This neutral 9 mana 4/12 dragon simply has spell damage plus 5, a keyword which makes all of your damage spells do that much more damage. Malygos is one of the oldest cards in the game, and is still one of the most problematic design space limiting cards in the game alongside Stone Tusk's Boar. I think Blizzard's original idea was for players to play Malygos on turn 9, hope he's able to survive with its 12 health, and enjoy the massive amount of spell damage on the following turn. You see, even though it doesn't make all of your spells do damage, and only boost the ones that already deal damage, it's still fairly easy to find a way to make Malygos very cheap. Over the years, there have been a ton of competitive to semi-viable Malygos decks, but for the sake of brevity, we'll only be going over the best ones. Miracle Rogue was a very high-skill combo deck that aimed to survive long enough until it could pull off a miracle turn to win the game. Built around the classic Rogue staple cards, this deck basically tries to conserve resources and survive long enough until it can pop off with Gadget Xan Auctioneer and try to draw through their entire deck, try to discount their entire hand, and use a discounted Malygos with a ton of cheap spells to try to kill their opponent. In more modern times, Aviancon decks have long abused Malygos for their one-turn kill combos. Basically, you play Aviana, Innervate, and Kun. This deck could make all other minions, including Malygos, cost 1 mana, while refreshing 10 mana crystals. From that point, using some combination of Sath Rovar, more Malygoses, Moonfires, and Living Roots, you could easily deal more than 30 damage. And while it may seem convoluted, Aviana Kun decks, and by extension Malygos, remain as a prominent threat in Wild, though not as much as the number 1 spot on this list. And at number 1, we have Dragon Queen Alexstrasza. This neutral 9 mana 8/8 adds 2 random dragons to your hand and sets their mana cost to 0 when played, but only if every card in your deck is unique. This card is really good and still one of the few minions that cost 8 or more mana worth playing that doesn't need to be cheated out. When players in Wild are paying 9 mana for a card and are still satisfied by the results, you know a card is busted. So, how good is it? Well, this unique card condition has been around for a really long time, and started off with Reno Jackson, one of the most played and well-liked cards of all time. Reno restores your hero to full health and created his own archetype just so control decks could survive and stabilize against aggro decks. And because of his conditional battlecry, he created Highlander, or Reno decks, where there can be only one of each card in your deck. And over time, and with more and more expansions, there's now a ton of good Highlander support. So Alexstrasza's conditional battlecry isn't a huge deal to pull off. In fact, she even recreated Highlander decks in Standard with Zephyros and without Reno, and had a deck built around her, just because of how good of a payoff of a card she was. So, how good was the actual battlecry? Dragon Queen Alexstrasza was printed in the Descent of Dragons expansion, which had just released some of the best expensive dragon minions of all time. Unfortunately, many of them had no support in their classes, but because of how Alexstrasza's battlecry is worded, she could generate them even if they weren't from your class. And with the new core set, she could also generate the amazing reworked dragon aspects too. On average, you're going to be generating 2 dragons worth about 6 mana each, meaning you can effectively get a cool 20 mana's worth of value by only paying 9. And the real icing on the cake is that instead of just summoning 2 dragons, she adds them to your hand for free, meaning you can get their battlecry effects, since they trigger on play and not on summon. Or you can hold on to them until a future turn. Eventually, Blizzard had to nerf her so that she couldn't generate herself, and increase the cost of the generated dragons to cost 1 mana each. Though this didn't really stop her play rate. She even had her mana cost reverted, where she still sees fairly consistent play in Wild. Alright, and that's the list. This video was actually suggested by a viewer, GM Radio, and was an idea that we really liked and wanted to turn into a video. So if you have any ideas you'd like to see to turn into videos or notice anything we missed, be sure to comment them down below in the comments.